I came home that afternoon expecting peace and quiet. Instead, I found half the neighborhood in my backyard. Music blasted from portable speakers. Children splashed in the deep end of my pool. A buffet table had been set up along the fence, and at least a dozen people lounged on my patio furniture, drinking, laughing, acting like they owned the place. A large, obnoxious sign was propped up near the entrance to my backyard. Flower parking, HOA members welcome. I took a deep breath, pinching the bridge of my nose before stepping forward. People barely noticed me as I crossed the yard, dodging wet footprints and discarded towels. But when I reached the patio, Karen Holloway herself turned to greet me, a champagne flute in hand. She smiled, a smug, self-satisfied smile, before tilting her head in fake surprise. "Oh, Daniel, I didn't expect you home so early." I glanced around. "Yeah, neither did I." Karen didn't apologize. She didn't even look guilty. Instead, she just sighed dramatically and took a sip of her drink. "Well, you see," she said, gesturing toward the pool, "your property wasn't really meeting community standards. It's such a lovely pool, but it was just going to waste." I stared at her. "Going to waste?" She nodded, completely unfazed. "Yes, since you rarely use it, we decided to repurpose it for the neighborhood." I let that sink in. "So let me get this straight," I said slowly. "You broke into my backyard, threw a party for HOA members, and now you're telling me my own pool isn't up to community standards?" Karen just shrugged, taking another sip of champagne. "It's better for everyone this way, don't you think?" she said sweetly. "Besides, if you did keep it up to standard, you wouldn't be getting this." She reached into her purse and pulled out a document, handing it to me with a smile. I unfolded it, scanning the words. HOA notice, mandatory pool maintenance fee. Amount due, $500. I let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're charging me to maintain my own pool?" Karen tilted her head. "Well, since it's benefiting the entire community, it's only fair that you contribute." I exhaled slowly, suppressing the urge to laugh in her face. I had spent years dealing with real estate disputes, property law, and legal loopholes. Karen Holloway had no idea what she had just started. I folded the notice, slipping it into my pocket. Then I met Karen's smug gaze and smiled. She thought this was her neighborhood. She thought she had control. She had no idea that she had just picked a fight with the worst possible person. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't even rip up the ridiculous $4,500 mandatory pool maintenance fine that Karen had so proudly handed me. Instead, I just smiled, because Karen Holloway had no idea what she had just done. The next morning, I stopped by the HOA office, a small, overpriced building HOA fees had undoubtedly paid for. I walked in, calm and professional, and placed my deed on the table in front of Karen. "This document," I said, tapping the paper, "clearly states that my property, including my backyard, my pool, and everything within my fence line, is private land. HOA regulations don't apply." Karen barely glanced at it before letting out a dramatic sigh. "Oh, Daniel," she said, shaking her head, "I appreciate your concern, but the HOA has already ruled on this. You can't rule on private property. That's not how the law works." She gave me that smile, the one people in power use when they think they've already won. "Well, you could take it to court," she mused, tapping her chin. "But I should warn you, the HOA has deep pockets. We'd hate to see you drained financially over something as small as a pool." I raised an eyebrow. "Are you threatening to sue me?" She tilted her head. "I'm simply saying that resisting the HOA never ends well for people in this neighborhood." Later that evening, while I was going over the HOA's latest bylaws, a soft knock at my door interrupted me. I opened it to find Mr. Porter, my next-door neighbor, a man in his 60s who had lived here for decades. He glanced around nervously before stepping closer. "You're new here," he said quietly, "so you don't know what Karen does to people." I folded my arms. "I can guess." He sighed. "She's done this before. First, it's the pool. Next, it'll be something else. I've seen people lose their garages, their driveways, their yards, all because she convinces the HOA that their land should be repurposed for the community." I could hear the frustration in his voice, the fear. "People have tried fighting back," he continued, shaking his head. "It never works. She always wins." I smiled. "She hasn't gone up against me yet." Porter frowned. "Who are you?" I glanced down at the HOA documents in my hand, curved, a laughably weak attempt at legal manipulation, then looked back at him. Let's just say, I said, I've taken down corporations bigger than this HOA. Porter blinked, confused, but I wasn't in the mood to explain. Karen thought she had me backed into a corner. She thought I would panic, fold, and obey. She had no idea that I was just waiting, because I wasn't going to push back immediately. No, I wanted the HOA to push itself off the cliff first. Karen was getting reckless. She thought she was untouchable, that her grip on the neighborhood was absolute, and that was exactly what I wanted. Over the next week, she pushed harder, escalating her power plays to levels that would make any half-competent attorney laugh out loud. First, she changed the locks on my pool gate. I came home one evening to find a brand new padlock installed, the old one removed without my permission. A smug little HOA notice was taped to the fence, reading, "Pool access now restricted to HOA members only. Violators will be fined." The next morning, another letter arrived in my mailbox. Final notice, HOA violation fees due immediately. Karen had personally approved fines totaling over $12,000, citing nonsense infractions like failure to comply with HOA community sharing policies, unauthorized usage of common HOA space, repeated refusal to adhere to HOA guidelines. The best part? None of those rules actually existed. Karen was just making them up as she went, convinced that no one would dare question her authority. But she wasn't done yet. The final move, the one I had been waiting for, happened 3 days later. I stepped outside that morning, sipping my coffee, and immediately noticed something different. A massive new sign had been installed on my fence. Community swimming pool, all HOA members are able to use. I stared at it for a long moment, then set my coffee cup down, calmly and carefully, before pulling out my phone and snapping a picture. She had just crossed the line from harassment to outright property theft. Karen had pushed things too far, but she didn't know. She had just walked straight into my trap. Around the neighborhood, I could see residents peeking out from their porches, watching the latest power move from the HOA. Some of them looked confused, others concerned. But nobody spoke up because they had seen what happened to people who fought back against Karen before. They knew the fines, the lawsuits, the never-ending legal threats that came when you challenged her. So they did what they always did. They stayed quiet. But that was fine, because soon, Karen wasn't going to be their problem anymore. She was about to become a federal one. Karen thought she was winning. She thought I would panic, fold under pressure, and give in like every other homeowner she had bullied before. But what she didn't realize, I wasn't just fighting back, I was playing a much bigger game. Step 1. Catch them in the act. The night after the community swimming pool sign appeared, I set up hidden cameras around my backyard. Not just 1 or 2, 6, covering every possible angle. And it didn't take long to pay off. Karen and 2 HOA board members came waltzing right in, unlocking the gate with their new HOA-issued keys, making themselves comfortable by the pool. They even brought paperwork, casually discussing how to start charging residents for access to a pool that wasn't even theirs. I recorded everything. Step 2. Follow the money. Karen was too confident, too convinced that nobody would ever dare dig into her finances. That was her second mistake. With a little effort and years of legal expertise under my belt, I got access to the HOA's financial records. What I found? Hundreds of thousands of dollars missing from the maintenance fund. Bogus invoices paid out to fake companies. Personal expenses disguised as HOA administrative costs, including vacations, shopping sprees, and suspicious wire transfers. Karen hadn't just abused her power, she had committed outright fraud. And now, I had the paper trail to prove it. Catch the bigger plan. I wasn't the only target. At the next HOA board meeting, I planted a recording device in the room. The things Karen said, how she planned to seize more private properties through fake violations, how she intended to force out elderly residents who weren't paying enough in HOA fees, how the HOA was negotiating with developers to buy out properties for commercial use without telling the homeowners. Every word was now on tape. She had exposed herself completely. I had everything I needed to take her down, but instead of calling the police right away, I waited. Because Karen, she was still digging her own grave. And I wanted her to fall all the way in before I pulled the trigger. Karen was basking in her victory. Surrounded by city officials, wealthy investors, and her most loyal supporters, she acted like a queen at a coronation. The pool, my pool, was packed with HOA members lounging in deck chairs, sipping expensive cocktails, and chatting like they belonged there. Music blared from rented speakers, a professional photographer snapped pictures, and banners lined the fences with bold, arrogant slogans: a stronger HOA, a better community. Together we grow. Karen Holloway, HOA president for life. I leaned against the fence, coffee in hand, watching it all unfold. This wasn't just another HOA party, it was a power move. Karen had invited city officials, members of the zoning board, and even a few developers, people she was grooming for deals, people she wanted to impress. To her, this event was proof that she had total control of the neighborhood, proof that she was untouchable. As the party reached its peak, Karen took the stage, a makeshift podium set up right in front of my own patio furniture, and tapped her champagne glass for attention. The crowd hushed, all eyes turning to her. She smiled, lifting her chin, confidence radiating off her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice dripping with pride, "when I took over as HOA president, this neighborhood was in chaos." She made a sweeping gesture, as if presenting her kingdom to her subjects. "But look at us now," she continued. "We have order, we have structure, we have control." A few people clapped, mostly HOA board members who had no choice. Karen took a slow sip of her champagne before delivering her final boast. "I've made this neighborhood a better place," she declared. Then, with absolute certainty, she added, "And no one can stand against the HOA." The crowd murmured. Some nodded in agreement. I just sipped my coffee because she had no idea what was coming next. Her empire was already cracking at the seams. One more move, one final blow, and everything she built would collapse right in front of her. And the best part, she was going to destroy herself. The party was at its peak. Karen stood on stage, basking in her moment of triumph, champagne glass in hand, surrounded by city officials, developers, and her most loyal HOA followers. She was so sure of herself, so convinced that she had won, which made it the perfect time for me to walk in. I stepped onto my own patio, dressed casually, coffee in one hand, a thick stack of documents in the other. The music lowered slightly as people turned to look at me. Conversations stopped. A few guests whispered. Karen's smile faltered for a brief second before she recovered, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Oh, Daniel," she said, her voice carrying through the crowd. "I didn't expect you to attend. Are you finally ready to be a team player?" I smirked, setting my coffee down before stepping closer to the podium. Then, I dropped the stack of documents onto the nearest table with a satisfying thud. "You like the law, don't you, Karen?" I said smoothly. "Let's read a little." The entire party fell silent. Karen's eyes flicked to the papers, then back to me. "What is this?" she asked, her voice suddenly much less confident. I reached over, flipping open the first set of documents. Evidence of HOA trespassing on private property, complete with timestamps, security footage stills, and clear images of Karen unlocking my pool gate. Fake HOA financial records, where thousands of dollars had been funneled into mysterious administrative fees that just so happened to benefit Karen. A set of contracts between Karen and a construction company, one that had bribed her in exchange for HOA-funded projects that would have lined her pockets. Karen froze, her face draining of color, her fingers around her champagne glass. I continued flipping pages, letting the evidence speak for itself. The city officials she had invited, they were suddenly very interested in the papers in front of them. A few guests murmured uncomfortably, realizing that this wasn't just a party anymore. It was an exposé. Karen snapped out of her daze, trying to keep her voice steady. This is all nonsense," she stammered. "You can't just walk in here and..." I cut her off. "I've already sent a copy of this to the authorities and my lawyer." Her breath hitched. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough for everyone to hear. "You have 24 hours to clean out your HOA office," I said, smirking as I delivered the final blow. Karen stood there, paralyzed, as her entire empire collapsed around her. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to sirens and flashing lights. Police cruisers were lined up in front of the HOA office, officers stepping out with a financial investigation warrant in hand. The news spread like wildfire. Within minutes, residents gathered, watching in shock as officers began removing boxes of files, computers, and financial records. Karen had ruled this neighborhood for years, acting as if she were untouchable. But now, her entire empire was collapsing in real time. The moment the truth came out, the residents turned furious. People who had once feared Karen were now demanding answers, demanding their money back. A group of homeowners marched straight up to the HOA office, shouting through the doors, "Where's our money, Karen? You scammed us for years. We want every cent back. You deserve to be locked up for this." Karen tried to hide, but it was too late. Her dirty dealings were exposed. Years of HOA fees misused, funneled into private accounts, disguised under bogus expenses. The same money she had taken from the people she claimed to protect, now it was evidence against her. By midday, the entire HOA board resigned one by one, scrambling to escape the sinking ship. With no leadership left, the HOA was officially dissolved. A decade of tyranny, wiped out in a single day. The residents, they celebrated. Some tore down HOA signs. Others gathered in small groups, talking excitedly about taking back control of their neighborhood. And as for my pool, by the afternoon, the locks were removed, the signs were gone, and my property was returned to its rightful owner. I sat by the pool, coffee in hand, watching as neighbors walked past, shaking their heads at the mess Karen had left behind. She had ruled this place like a queen. But now, she was just another fraud who lost everything. Karen had spent years making people fear her. She had bullied homeowners, stolen from them, and crushed anyone who dared to stand against her. But now, she was the one in handcuffs. Her arrest was swift. After the HOA was dissolved, the investigation moved fast. With so much evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and trespassing, there was no escape. The moment she stepped out of her house, FBI agents and local law enforcement were waiting. "Karen Holloway, you're under arrest for financial fraud, abuse of power, and criminal trespassing," twisting in their grip. "You can't do this. I am the hoe." But nobody cared. The same neighbors who had once feared her now watched with satisfaction as she was led away in cuffs. Some even cheered. At her trial, Karen refused to accept reality. Even as the prosecution laid out mountains of evidence, even as the judge read out the charges, she still fought back. She slammed her hands on the table, her voice rising. "I was framed. This is a setup. I was just doing what was best for the community." The courtroom remained silent. Nobody believed her. And then her eyes landed on me, sitting calmly in the front row, watching the downfall she had brought upon herself. Her face twisted in shock, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Who are you?" I stood up slowly, adjusting my tie, letting the moment stretch. Then, with a slight smirk, I said, "Someone you should never have messed with." Karen's mouth opened, but before she could say anything else, the guards led her away. Her reign was over. And I had already moved on. With Karen gone and the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood changed overnight. At first, there was a sense of uncertainty. For so long, people had lived under strict HOA control, afraid that a single out-of-place lawn ornament or a car parked at the wrong angle could lead to fines, warnings, or worse, forced compliance. But as the days passed, something remarkable happened. People stopped being afraid. They reclaimed their homes, finally able to make their own choices without worrying about some power-hungry HOA board watching over them. Small changes started popping up everywhere. One neighbor, Mr. Porter, who had been too afraid to fight back against Karen's tyranny, repainted his house a deep blue that the HOA would have never allowed. The Johnsons down the street put up a massive backyard play set for their kids, something Karen had once fined them for attempting. Another family, who had been threatened with eviction for growing vegetables in their yard, planted an even bigger garden, tomatoes, squash, peppers, all thriving under the sun, with no one to tell them otherwise. The neighborhood didn't fall apart without the HOA's rules. It flourished. And as time went on, people began to realize the truth. Karen's rules had never been about protecting property values or community order. They had been about control. And now that she was gone, that control was never coming back. But while the community moved on, there was one question that still lingered. Me. People whispered, speculated, tried to piece together the puzzle. Some believed I was connected to law enforcement, maybe even an undercover investigator. Others thought I was a retired judge, a corporate attorney, or even a government agent sent to take down corruption. No one knew for sure, but one thing was clear. After watching what happened to Karen, nobody dared to dig too deep. One afternoon, while I was relaxing by my pool, now fully reclaimed, free of HOA interference, a few neighbors stopped by. One of them, Tom, the same man who had once asked me what I did for a living, scratched the back of his head and finally said, "So, Dan, I think a lot of us are wondering, who are you really?" I looked at him, then at the others who had gathered, all waiting for an answer. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the question hang in the air. Then, with a small smirk, I shrugged. "Just a guy," I said, leaning back in my chair. Then, after a pause, I added, "A guy who likes to swim in his own pool." That was all they needed to know. And just like that, the conversation ended. The sun was shining, the water in my pool was calm, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood was finally at peace. No Karen, no HOA, no more ridiculous rules, fines, or threats. Just quiet. Exactly how I liked it. I leaned back in my chair, coffee in hand, letting the warmth of the afternoon settle in. That's when I heard footsteps approaching. I glanced up as Tom, my ever-curious neighbor, strolled over, hands in his pockets. For weeks, people had been buzzing about Karen's downfall. They all had theories about what had really happened, about how everything had collapsed so perfectly. And Tom, he was still trying to figure me out. He stopped a few feet away, eyeing the crystal-clear water of my once-claimed pool before giving me a nod. "You know," he said slowly, "this neighborhood is finally free." I smirked. "Yep." He hesitated, then finally asked, "Do you think the HOA will ever come back?" For a moment, I didn't answer. I simply glanced up at the sky, watching a few wispy clouds drift by, feeling the calm that had finally settled over the place. Then I let out a small chuckle, shaking my head slightly. "No," I said, taking another sip of my coffee. Then with a smirk, I added, "I don't let the enemy come back twice." Tom studied me for a second, as if trying to decide if he really wanted to know what I meant by that. Then he just nodded, and without another word, he walked away. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. Some people fight battles head on. Some people run from them. Me, I play the long game. And the best part, Karen never even realized she had been playing my game all along.